Hello, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to our November 2017 educational webinar. We're so delighted to have you. My name is Mark Putnam. I'm the CEO of Global Ethics Solutions, and we're excited to offer these webinars each month just to so we can feature an expert in the compliance and ethics field to share their knowledge and experience. And it's just a great way for those of us on LinkedIn to connect and to learn something new and to hear what some other experts have to say. So good morning, everyone. It's so great to have you today. And today we have a real treat. We have Patty Tehrani is going to share today. And we're excited to have her on why codes of conduct are more important now than ever. So Patty is an experienced compliance attorney and founder of the Policy Patty Toolkit. Patty has nearly 20 years experience in compliance, including senior in-house roles at top financial institutions, authoring articles and blogs, delivering webinars, and providing advisory and consulting support. She recently released the Policy Patty Toolkit Library, a compilation of guides on governance, risk, and compliance functions. Patty's a graduate of Binghamton University and has earned her Juris Doctorate from American University, Washington College of Law. She's a member of the New York and Supreme Court bars, and we are so delighted to have Patty share with us today. This is going to be an amazing presentation full of information. So if you're not taking notes, we'll definitely have this up on the YouTube and the blog, and we'll post it up there. But lots of good stuff. So we're super excited to have Patty today. So Patty, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and hello, everybody. For today's presentation, Mark and I thought it would be helpful to cover the importance of codes for organizations, especially in light of the never-ending ethical failures that we have all been watching at various corporations. So as this slide reflects, what I hope to cover today is some of the basics on codes, a process for updating and creating codes of conduct, and tips that I've picked up in my experience with creating and updating codes. And I'm going to end with some tools that I think may be helpful to your efforts. What I hope you take away from this presentation is that you'll have more insights in terms of why you need a code of conduct, what the code should include. And this has been a challenge, I think, for a number of companies, exactly what it is that their code should include. Sometimes I think they try to include too much information, and the code is not really designed to cover all issues, but clearly relevant issues. Who should be involved? And as a compliance and legal professional, I know that all too often it falls on compliance folks, but as you'll hear me talk about, it really needs to be a collaborative process. How to create a code or update it so that it remains effective, and I think importantly, how to assess the effectiveness of your code of conduct. Now, on this slide, I included this to show what I believe has been the long history of some of the ethical shortcomings that a number of companies and corporations have faced over the years, and we're all familiar with them. And while the code is not an automatic get out of jail pass, if you will, it's been my experience that it's the document that helps people understand a lot about an organization. And it's typically the document that most, if not all, employees are familiar with. So that's why it's really important that you focus and pay attention to the code, because it's a foundational piece to your ethics and compliance program. When it's done properly, it can set the stage for your program's success. Unfortunately, when it's not, when it's incomplete or poorly drafted or prepared, your program, your compliance and ethics program resides on what I would say would be a weak foundational document, and it's hard to leverage off of that. So given the role that the code can play in your company's success, it really does make sense that you get the code done properly and get it done right. So let's start with some basics. Before we delve into the process, the reason I wanted to cover some basics is because it's important to have a level understanding as to what it is we need to do. For me, it's always been important that when I start an initiative, I sit back and I say to myself, what are the key questions? What are the key objectives that I want to address with the initiative? So in this slide, I listed some questions that you could be asking yourself when you're considering what it is you need to do when creating or updating your code. I think the most critical of these is basically, if you have a code, whether or not you know if it's working, and if you think it is, how have you reached that conclusion? I think it's really important to assess that, and we'll talk about some factors you can consider shortly. If some of you are not sure, and hence why you're participating, we're going to provide you with some guidance to help you make that determination. So, as part of the basics, I wanted to provide you with a better understanding of what a code of conduct is. I'm not going to read the detail here, but I think what is important to understand is that codes come in all shapes and sizes and, frankly, different levels of quality. Given the attention and the focus that's placed on them, it's really important that each code gets the attention that it deserves. You want to make sure that your code serves as both a principal statement of the way that you are conducting your business, and remember that it's the chief communication tool for your ethics and compliance program. You want to understand that the code generally embodies those standards that your company has set for itself. And in some cases, companies go so far as to the standards they want to aspire towards. And then the other thing that I think is really important is that the code reflects those key ethics and compliance risks that the company seeks to prevent, to detect, and manage should a violation occur. Now, a code does not reside in a vacuum. And in order for a code to be effective, it needs to be aligned with some very key tenets of your organizational culture and structure. You want to make sure that with respect to the code, that it lines up with your mission, your values, and other aspects of its culture. For most companies, it's the importance of this is why they spend the time and effort to maintaining their codes, because they understand that an effective code will have a positive benefit not only on its employees, but other key stakeholders such as their customers, business partners, regulators, and others. Unfortunately, there are also those instances when companies do not put the time and effort. And to be frank, they do the bare minimum. And that's a surprise, but I've experienced that where their effort is really just to make sure that they have a code and that it is refreshed, but not refreshed necessarily in a meaningful way. The mistake in doing that, and what these organizations often face, is that it sends the wrong message. It sends the wrong message to your employees. It sends the wrong message in that I think, sends a negative message in terms of what leadership's focus is as far as its commitment to its culture and standards. And it certainly sends a message that I've heard from some employees from time to time that my company really doesn't view the code as being that important, so I don't really think it is. Now, to me, why an effective code is critically important is that it serves as a roadmap to help employees deal with difficult situations. How does it do this? Now, as this slide reflects, it's your code that can help you determine what steps to take, and if it's not clear what steps to take, who to contact to help you out. Now, this will help your company in that when your employees are acting in the right and proper way, it helps your company prevent legal and regulatory violations, which we know is a critical, if not primary objective of having a code. But in addition to that, it also helps you with other stakeholders. Customers like companies that have high standards and stand by them, so you can garner greater customer loyalty. Your suppliers and business partners, a growing concern with them is making sure that they do business with reputable outfits. So it's important to them and it builds stronger relationships with them. Not to forget, you also have your industry regulators. Having an effective code strengthens the trust and respect that you will have with them and other stakeholders because you're living up to the expectations that you've established, and all around, it's goodwill that you're engendering. The bottom line is that your code builds a stronger reputation for integrity by helping your company do what it says it will do and what it wants to do. Now, I wanted to cover why you need a code. I've mentioned the fact that regulatory requirements are out there. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but it's important for you to remember that depending on which industry you operate, you may have regulations that require you to have a code and to have specific components to your code. So make sure you know what they are. The granddaddy of them all, the U.S. Federal Sentencing Guidelines, which applies to most companies. These guidelines have been in existence since 1991. There have been a series of amendments, but at the end of the day, the guidelines are very clear that codes are essential to an organization's ethics and compliance program. But it's not just regulatory requirements that predicate why you need a code. Depending again on your industry, there are best practices, industry practices, norms that you should be factoring in terms of codes and what types of information is required. As I mentioned before, business partners, as part of due diligence, as part of engagements, particularly in the procurement processes, more and more companies are being required to demonstrate that they have effective and developed and robust ethics and compliance programs in place. I'm not going to go into detail, but I wanted you to have at your disposal information again on the federal sentencing guidelines in terms of the necessity for having a code. And I've highlighted for you the key principle that most rely on in terms of the guidelines and the necessity. So now that we have some basics on what codes are, I wanted to quickly cover how it is that you can gauge their effectiveness, which is what I mentioned up front, a really critical part of your development and maintenance process. I've summed it up in three baskets, basically, in terms of criteria or considerations that you can use to help you measure, is your code doing what it is that you intend it to do? The first one that I think is important is it up to date? Is it changing? Is it addressing the changes within your organization, within your industry, rule changes? Is it lined up with your corporate culture? And that's pretty much done when you maintain it on a regular basis. The other one is it easy to understand? And I think this is really where the user community and input from them and feedback from them is critically important. Is it easy to understand? Is it user-friendly? Or is it too legalistic and too wordy so that people have a hard time understanding what the code means, what the principles intend to convey? And I've seen this in my experience with issues and questions that have come up in the ethics hotline, which I'll talk to, when people are just unclear what the code said. And this one, the last one, I think is very important. Often the time is spent on content, but there should also be a focus on whether or not it's engaging. You can have a fantastic code in terms of substance, but if it's boring, if it's not appealing in some fashion, then unfortunately it's not going to engage, it's not going to be engaging, and it's not going to be something that people will want to pick up. So having it be engaging and interesting is really important to its effectiveness. With that, I wanted to get into the part that I think is often a challenge, and that is, what is it that your code needs to cover? And for me, this has always been one of the difficult parts, because there's so much that you want to try to cover in this document. And if you try to cover everything, it's going to balloon into a document that's just not usable for the end users. So you need to be judicious. You need to be smart about what it is that you want to factor in. And I've listed here a series of factors that I think you can use in trying to determine what it is that you need to cover. Keep in mind that this should be a thoughtful, careful process, and one that is done with input from others, and we'll talk about that. These questions can help you at least draft an outline, and bear in mind that the key premise here is that however your outline ends up forming or shaping, that you keep in mind that it needs to be aligned with the other critical documents for your company. What you don't want is your code saying one thing, your policy saying another, or your core values. If they are not consistent, or if there are inconsistencies, it's going to be confusing to your employees and will diminish your document's effectiveness. Keeping in line with trying to figure out the outline and the content, I just wanted to, again, give you an example of what are the key components: message, values, risk areas, making sure that you have a process or a discussion about how to raise questions, key policies that you want to factor in, sources for guidance, and as part of the appealing, engaging part, making sure that you have ways to reinforce the message of your codes. FAQs are often used, vignettes, quizzes, things of that nature. That's the part that's interactive and engaging, and quite frankly is the best way to reinforce the message. Here I've laid out sources that I've tapped into in terms of trying to build out my outline for the code. My recommendation at the end of the day is you can seek input from those stakeholders within your organization. You should definitely ask your leadership what's the minimum they expect of employees. And a really good tip is canvass the internet, see what other companies have out there. And by the way, when you're doing that, make sure you check the dates. What you don't want to do is you don't want to use an out-of-date code to help guide your outline. So check the dates, check for those codes that have been updated recently in this past year, for example, and take a look at all this information and try to map out where you see common points, and then sit down with your team, as we'll discuss shortly, and go through whether or not it makes sense to include those topics and which additional or specific topics may be relevant for your organization. Here again, just a sample outline of what types of topics, and also organization, because it's really important as part of the navigation and easy to understand to organize your code. So I just gave you a sample of what could work in terms of topics and organization. Now, with that, let's talk quickly about who should be involved. As I mentioned, most of the time when you're talking about codes, people assume it's the legal and compliance department, but the reality is that your code applies to everyone in your organization, and in some cases it goes beyond and may apply to third parties. You need to make sure that your code is developed and maintained in a collaborative way. That's why it's important to make sure that you have participation from all of your departments, from all of your functions. In addition, it's really important to know who's responsible for what. On this slide, I've listed a series of key roles: the administrator, who's going to basically lead the effort, owners and approvers, the develop and maintenance team, the people who are going to look at the substance, the launch and communications. Critically important that you know that as part of the whole effort, beyond the substance and the content, you need to communicate and get it out there, get the message out there. The monitoring and enforcement, who's going to monitor for compliance, and whether or not you want to get input from the business partners and vendors and third parties if your code applies to them. Now, here I've laid out possible assignments for your reference. you can use this and adapt it to your needs. If you have an ethics officer, that would be the likely lead to help maintain and develop your code. The one thing that I wanted to highlight here, which I think is critically important, is ownership, because here I want to stress my recommendation has always been that in terms of ownership or at least approval, you want to make sure that your senior management, whether it's your CEO or your board of directors, they're involved, they're in the process. So having them sign off on your code sends a very strong message to your employees, to your stakeholders, that management is behind this document and they are committed to this document. So I wanted to highlight that. And then I've listed other areas that could be involved in the development as far as the other launch and monitoring. On this slide, I wanted to just outline for you what I call a possible process for helping you develop and maintain. And quickly, at the end of the day, what you want to make sure is that when you're undertaking this process, you have a team or a group of people that are going to help, that you have some kind of plan. And here it's, again, you don't need to be a project manager, but it's someone who's going to help you a plan that's going to help you guide through these steps, determine the content, making sure that you have the content approved and signed off before you start drafting. The develop and update is the draft and review part. The approval, you do not want to publish your code if you do not have a record of approval. I've seen that happen. It is not a good scenario to be in, to explain to auditors or regulators or others. You want to make sure that you finalize the code as part and get it launched. Implement the code. I highlight this one because I want to make sure that people understand it shouldn't be a document on a shelf, on the web, or in a folder. Make sure you operationalize the code. Make sure you integrate the code, which means updating your policies so that they remain consistent. You monitor compliance with your code by measuring its effectiveness, and this is a good place that I'll tell you whether parts are working and parts are not. And a periodic review, which is the maintenance part. Remember, this is an important document and you want to refresh it from time to time. This next slide illustrates what I just covered. I typically put processes in this fashion to more readily illustrate the process. And as we will discuss, it's once you've laid the process out for what works for you, it'll be a good way for you to leverage it for future undertakings. Now, with that said, I want to quickly cover some key tips in the remaining few minutes that we have. I covered basics in the process. What are some of the tips that I've picked up based on my experience? And the first one, as I mentioned before, planning, planning, planning. Don't fret, don't be worried, but it's really important that you have some type of plan that'll let you know what you need to get done, what you have, when you need to get it done, who can help you. And in some cases, depending on how much you need to do, if there's a budget, if you have a very evolved communications plan. What's critically important here is transparency and discipline and organization. If you're not a project manager like myself, you think it as an elaborate to-do list, but one that you'll be able to leverage off of, as I mentioned earlier, for future undertakings. I spent a lot of time on content. I'm not really, in the interest of time, not going to get into it, but I laid in the next few slides here, I just wanted to let you know more and tips that I've picked up in terms of content that you can factor into your piece. In terms of this slide here, the thing that I just wanted to emphasize, and I mentioned previously, but it's really important that I highlight again, the design of your code is so critically important. There are times when policies are listed in a code, but there's no link to them, there's no reference, so people are left where to find. Sometimes the code fonts are so small it's hard to read, to make sure that that's not the case. It's really great to use caps and bolds if you want to emphasize points, and it's nice up front to tell people what that means. Be mindful that if you're operating on a global front, that you should be thinking about translations and planning accordingly. It'll be much more effective for your employees as a result. And also making sure that it has the look and feel of what a branding. Sometimes a code document comes out, and because it's not in line with the branding and of your company, your employees may not associate it as a document that belongs to the company. So keep that in mind. The other part too, just quickly, launch and awareness. There's, as I mentioned, lots of time and effort is often spent on content, but I don't know that as much time is spent on launch and awareness. And this to me is as critical as the content. People need to know what the code is about, so they need to get information on it. There's so many different channels, so many different ways to do it. There's the typical, which is the communication, the emails that go out. Some companies still print hard copies. When you're sending a message out, again, it's really helpful and important to see if you can get the message from senior management. Employee hotlines, and Mark can speak to this in light of the global Integra line. These are so critical because you need to have a tool that will facilitate referrals, training, and not just one time, but incorporated into a specific training as well as other training where you can put reminders. I love periodic compliance reminders. I think they're really important. If you want to do acknowledgments that someone has received, bear in mind there's an administration that's involved, so you want to make sure that you track who has done it and who hasn't. And in meetings, in town halls, it's a great idea to have it mentioned from time to time so that you continuously reinforce and make employees aware. The thing that I think is also important here is investigation and reporting process, making sure that you have something in place that will facilitate once you get queries and questions, because what you don't want to happen is you don't want to encourage employees to report their concerns and then not have a process to review those concerns, to act on those concerns, and to notify employees what's done. This has been an area that I think has sometimes been problematic for organizations, so I really wanted to make sure that you factored this into your overall approach. And then my last tip here is maintenance. As I mentioned before, make sure that you are scheduling some type of regular review. How often, how frequent is up to you, depending. In some cases, there may be a regulation that requires an annual review, or it might be that you prefer to do it every couple of years. That's subject to your needs and requirements, but get it on a regular review schedule and leverage off of what you've done in the initial production. That's why that project plan is very helpful, so that you can basically guide your efforts, update that as necessary. And when you're maintaining your document, do not forget to think about organizational changes, regulatory changes, and one other point that I mentioned, input from your employees, whether through the hotline, complaints, or others. See what they're telling you about this document. See what audits and monitoring, compliance monitoring is letting you know about this document, so that you can factor that into your next refresh. My last, just in conclusion, what I wanted to make sure I highlighted here, there's no one size fits all. At the end of the day, the guidance here is really for your reference. It's not designed to be the definitive source. You need to define what you think works best for you, and you can certainly use the tips and practical guidance that's here. But make sure at the end of the day that your code aligns with your values, your standards, and your policies. Make sure you refresh it from time to time. Keep it simple and engaging. Keep your audience informed about it through different methods and channels. In the end, make your code one that you would be proud to share with others. Just quickly, a couple of tools that I included here: a checklist and a sample compliance reminder, and a plug here for the Policy Patty Toolkit, which includes a roadmap on the code. And with that, I want to thank you all for your time. I'm going to turn it over to Mark to see if there are any further questions.
Thank you so much, Patty. That was excellent. Boy, we learned lots of great information, which is definitely relevant today. So thank you. I really appreciate that. want to be respectful of time here, so let us help you if your company is in need of some pieces to help this code as far as implementing your compliance systems. Let us know. We have some pieces that can help. We have our IntegraLine event management system. It's a powerful software tool, reporting tool that allows your employees to report and track, and we also includes 24/7 helpline in Canada, USA, and Mexico, and it's just a great tool to help your human resources department and compliance department receive those reports and process them. And of course, we have e-learning on a variety of topics, and our motto is connecting character and compliance. We want to really build strong people and build character as we train. So please visit us, and of course, visit Patty's website, the Policy Patty Toolkit, to give you some excellent resources. We're so pleased to have her and be working with her. So thank you, everyone. Really want to say that we do appreciate you joining us. We are on the third Thursday of each month. Next month is December, so we're going to be probably pushing that up a week so we don't conflict with the Christmas holidays. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us, and have a great month.